Thank you, Yana, and thank you to everybody working at the festival and everybody at Chanel for helping to put this event together, and thank you to all of you for being here. Before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I should say my name's Merve Emre. I'm a staff writer at The New Yorker and a professor of English literature. And before I introduce our wonderful panelists for Man versus Machine, Can the Arts Save Humanity? I'd just like to do a little poll of the room. How many people here have used ChatGPT at some point in the past 6 to 8 months? Excellent. Can some of you share what you have used ChatGPT for? Can I call on some of the brave students in the audience? Please do not tell me you used it to write a paper for you, which you then handed in. If that's what you've done, please lie to me, but tell me what you've used ChatGPT for. Yes, what's your name?
Andy.
Andy, what have you used it for?
One thing I found it really useful for is actually coming up with recommendations. So for instance, I did have to write a paper and I was thinking, oh, I like these movies. Are there any other movies or books or whatnot that would be useful for me to read? And it actually came up with a pretty good comprehensive list of interesting books and movies related to like what I was researching at the time.
Okay, so use it to generate extra research or a little database, personal database of research. What else? Other people, what have you used ChatGPT for? What's your name?
I'm Lottie.
Lottie.
I went on a trip with my friends to a city that we'd never heard of, so we just asked it to write a 3-day itinerary, and we basically followed it, including like restaurants, museums, all those kind of things.
Okay, so you used ChatGPT as a personal concierge service to plan this trip that you took. Very interesting. Other people? Let me get 2, 3 more brave souls sharing what they used ChatGPT for. Come on. I saw many people raise their hands, so you have to, someone, yes, what's your name? Thomas.
So, I mean, I've only really used it to kind of play around with it. When I was applying to PhD programs, I was curious to see what it would spit out.
When you were writing a personal statement to apply, or?
Well, yeah, most of a research proposal.
A research proposal.
I think it just made up texts. Like it just attributed, would find sort of real scholars and produce these kind of possible titles, but the thing didn't actually exist. And like also the cadence of the sentences is pretty jarring to me.
Okay, so you used it to try to create a document that you might use for the kind of, because, okay, curiosity drove you to use it. One more, let us take one more. Yes, what's your name?
Liberty. I used it to format a vocab list into a table because I couldn't be bothered to enter all the data manually.
Okay, all right, so you used it to save yourself a little bit of work. So what I am hearing in these 4 wonderful comments, and thank you for being brave enough to speak, is more or less the theme of our panel today, which is that if you have spent any amount of time on a college classroom, in a newsroom, in a museum, in any kind of culture-producing institution today, you know that the kinds of technologies that are being developed, on the one hand, pose existential threats to the kind of work that creative people do, and on the other hand, can possibly provide incredible opportunities for how we think about the relationship between art and technology. And our 4 panelists are here to help us think a little bit more about what those dangers might be and about what those opportunities might be. So I will introduce them now. And actually, as I am introducing you, can you please tell me, or tell the audience, what your interaction with either ChatGPT, or we can broaden this out, any kind of technology, any kind of mechanical production has been in, say, the past year? Can I start with you, Naomi?
Of course.
Okay, yeah. Excellent. Naomi Ishiguro is a writer of fiction. Her story collection, Escape Routes, was published in 2020, and her first novel, Common Ground, was published in 2021 or 2?
2021.
2021. Paperback 2022. I had trouble reading my own handwriting. I'm sorry. James Marriott, the columnist, should not be confused with the YouTube phenomenon James Marriott, who is in fact his doppelganger. He writes for The Times, covering society, ideas, and culture. He does very funny reviews of podcasts. And he seems to specialize in annoying people whom I also find annoying. So well done. Before joining the paper, he worked in the rare book trade, specializing in 17th century manuscripts. And we can think about how paper was itself an extraordinary technological innovation that people had very strong responses to. James McAuley, but I hear you go by Jake.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Jake, so we don't have two Jameses. This helps me. Yeah. Jake McAuley is a global opinion contributing columnist at the Washington Post and is the former Paris correspondent for the newspaper. He has a DPhil in French history from Oxford. And Luke Pepera, who we were on this panel together last year, is a writer, broadcaster, anthropologist, and historian specializing in African history. The first thing I asked him when I saw him was, have you finished your book that you were working on last year?
Indeed.
And he has indeed. And it is called Motherland, 500,000 Years of African History, Culture, and Identity, and it will be out in 2025. Welcome to our panelists. So, Naomi, can I start with you? Can you talk to us a little bit about the last time you used any form of technology, mechanization to do the work you do as a novelist, and what you see as the perils and the possibilities of our moment?
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's a sort of huge topic. I think I haven't used ChatGPT or anything like that to write, or as like any kind of writing tool as yet. I'm sort of inherently suspicious of it. I'm also an English teacher, so I have that sort of fear that my students are actually turning in these sort of false essays, and I have to sniff them out. But I think for me the biggest thing was Google Maps and Google Images, because you can write. I wrote a story set in New York. I have only been to New York for about 24 hours in between, like on a plane layoff. But you could kind of, you can see how streets connect, and you can imagine how your characters sort of walk around, and you think, oh, well, this is interesting because this is just a block from this, so that could happen. And you can kind of Google image things and think, oh, that's what that coffee shop looks like, or that's what that location looks like. So I think this sort of, we call it Google Earth or Google Maps as kind of stalker websites, but it's kind of bizarrely useful for writers if you're just kind of location hunting or kind of inspiration hunting. So I'd say that has been the most useful thing for me in how I write fiction. I don't know if.
And what about the most perilous thing? Do you have a counter story to that?
It's probably just very boring things. I worry about things like copyright and stuff like that. The idea that at the moment, sort of the machine learning, AI is being taught by sort of lots of things that are out of copyright, but also books that like by us maybe, things that are in copyright that are just sort of somewhere on the internet, and they're sort of being. The machines are kind of learning how to use language sort of by assimilating this sort of giant data set of everyone's work. Yeah, I do think there's a real difficulty to actually sort of make a living and a life as a young writer in sort of this country, in many places today. And yeah, if it's another way that sort of copyright and your rights over your own work as a writer get sort of eroded, then I think that's quite worrying. So yeah, I think that's probably my biggest worry.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. So on the one hand, the possibilities of Google Maps.
Yes.
On the other hand, the fact that the work of many people in this room is probably being used to train artificial intelligence technologies. And actually, I don't know if all of you have seen it, but The Atlantic just published an article recently where they link to a database where you can put in your own name to see if your books are being used. If there have been pirated versions of your books that have been fed into the algorithmic systems that are used to train AI. And because writers are vain creatures, people immediately were like Instagramming the fact that their books were being used to train AI as if this were a kind of badge of pride. So, Jake.
So, I mean, first of all, my just brief personal foray into ChatGPT, I'm getting married in a month, and it is really useful for sort of first drafts of thank you notes for any number of sort of, there's only so many times you can thank somebody for the same little nut bowl. So, highly recommend that. But then, most of my work, so I'm also a historian, and I work specifically on Holocaust history. And so, I mean, sort of similar to what you were saying, digital archives are essential sources, right? And so much more is available to all of us, and I imagine to Luke as well, with your work, that, in even 10 years ago, we might have had to travel to see, that has made it a lot more accessible and easier also to manipulate, with finding aids and search tools and all of that. But by the same token, I mean, one thing that I'm really struck by in my field, so the latest use of technology in Holocaust studies in particular is these things called survivor holograms. So an anxiety on many of our minds is that we are coming up on a moment where there will soon be no survivors, right? And in fact, already the only survivors left are child survivors. So it's not like what I had when I was growing up, where you had these people who had lived through the horrors of the camps coming and talking to you. You now, this is pioneered through the Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation at USC. They recorded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours with some of the last remaining survivors. And now in museums across America, and I believe soon in the UK, you have these auditoriums where you go in and sit like you're sitting now, and there is a digital hologram of a survivor who comes on and is human by so many ways. You can ask them jokes, you can ask them their favorite color. The idea is to show the full spectrum of a person, not just a sort of documentary talking head. But it raises really, I think, complicated and unsettling questions, including the fact that we are now relying on literal distortions to tell this truth that we are worried about vanishing. And I don't know, it both continues the value of testimony in the present, but it also raises, I think, deep questions about what we're doing when we look at the past with sources like that. So that's what I've been thinking about a lot lately.
So on the one hand, the incredible capacity that we have now to make archives available relatively democratically. Yeah. How many people have used Google Books? Right, okay, so that's just one very obvious example. And on the other hand, let's call it virtualization of human beings and the virtualization of history in forms that can be easily manipulated, corrupted, and are just manufactured.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
James.
Yeah, I think I first used ChatGPT about a year ago, at which point it seemed like a wonderful and hilarious thing. Me and my flatmate were making it sort of do comic, preposterous speeches. So we made it do a speech in the style of Donald Trump about turnips. And we said, as if you were unsuccessfully trying to deny that you're sexually attracted to turnips. And it was really funny. It was really funny. And I thought this was like hilarious and brilliant. And then we were writing making it write sort of insulting poems about each other's failure to clean up the kitchen and things like that. And then after a few months, I was like, oh God, this is actually also terrifying and it could probably do my job one day. And then I stopped using it because it just disturbs me too much.
Where's the happy story, though?
The happy story is the hilarious
I'm so
fake
sorry.
speeches
Yes,
about
of course.
tennis.
Well, of course, that's a happy story. I'm so sorry. Okay.
It was probably.
It made you happy.
It was
All
very,
right.
It was very immature.
And that makes us happy.
I shouldn't have been being so childish, really. But it was funny at the time. Maybe you had to be.
Well, but I will say, on the one hand, the fact that these technologies can be a source of play, and art is always a space for the play of the imagination, for the play of our ideas. And on the other hand, the anxiety that one day what you are playing with will actually take your job. So the fear that our labor will become automated, that there might not be a need for human beings with specifically human capacities anymore. Luke.
Well, I think, I've come across, I use technology a lot in my work, but I also use it for play. It's interesting that you mentioned that. And, as a consumer, obviously, it's incredibly useful, for research purposes. But, it's always that initial tool that will help me get somewhere. I know that if you want to, if I want to, write something, especially, writing African history in a field that's not, very, very well covered, very well documented, going as close as you can to the origin is really, really important for doing important and groundbreaking work that no one has ever done before, and something that's original. But so I use the internet for that. Whenever I'm looking, for example, for books to read, I start off in JSTOR and I'll look for articles on the topic, and I can do that through my alumni. So I always look, and then I'll look at. But then what I'll always do is I'll look at the the bibliography or the endnotes, and then I'll find that book in the library, and then I'll look at the endnotes of that one. Then I'll find another book somewhere hidden across, and that's where I come across the most interesting nuggets of information. And then for play as a consumer, I've actually from a very young age was really interested in, in games and in video games. And actually, if you are interested in video games or know anything about that field, you know that AI has been used in those products since, the 80s and 90s. It's actually quite a big part of it. So it's when you couldn't play with friends. Nowadays you have, these massive, multiplayer online things you can play with people all around the world, et cetera, et cetera. But, back in the day with the arcade, if you had like Pong or something, you were playing against a computer, but that was essentially a very rudimentary AI. So it was one of the fields that was actually pioneering the use of AI and things. And it was, it was actually a positive thing, with some of my friends were in, in other places in the world, et cetera. It's like, or, if I didn't have anybody around, using these very basic systems, there was still a way to play with someone who kind of emulated that. And it kind of gave a little bit of, you could use it to, improve your play or to think about different aspects. I mean, anyone else as well who's played online chess, will understand that. I think what's really interesting about the, what everybody has said, not only the people in the audience, but on the panel have talked about using ChatGPT is, in the similar way that I've used JSON, is always as an initial tool, what is the creative act that is happening there? It is you saying, I want to do X, Y, and Z. That is my vision. That is what I want to do. How you get there can be any number of ways. Some people use ChatGPT. Some people use the internet. Some people use books. Some people use people. If you're traveling, I'll often ask friends or someone who lives there, I'll say, can you recommend X, Y, and Z? It's just a different tool for getting to the same place. But, getting to a point where then the tool tells you what you must do. See, for me, that's not creative. The spark of creativity is the person, the human being saying, I want to achieve X, Y, and Z. How do I get there? And then the technology is always a tool. So I think I'm not so worried so much whenever I think about, this technology, about it necessarily replacing, that, the origin of human creativity. What for me is the essence of human creativity, and actually looking at the potential of, the tools. What worries me actually is that always historically new technologies have been used to exploit. I mean, I was talking, earlier with Naomi, and I was talking to him, I was mentioning how sometimes I'll talk to my dad, and he said that, he remembers seeing adverts in the 70s and 80s about how people would be celebrating new technology because they say that, well, now that we have all these machines, etc., to do things for us, we're going to have a ton more leisure time, and people are like really looking forward to that. And now you're living in 2023, and you can't get away. Like, it sometimes feels like you don't have, it feels like actually your time is a lot more restricted, and there are loads of demands on your time, and you have to do a lot more to carve out time because people use the technology, corporates or whoever use the technology to get at you wherever you are. You can't tell an email without getting recommendations and subscribers on your social media, and you get adverts, and you get this and this and that. So that's actually what worries me, is how AI is going to be exploited. And I think it's going to start off usually as, I think it's going to be in the kind of corporate and, marketing. It's going to be trying to predict what people want to, buy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's and to take away people's attention from the things that they really want to do. So that's kind of what worries me, how people are going to think, well, how can we use this to, achieve our own ends, our own goals, not thinking so much about the person as a person who's on the end of it, but as a consumer, as a product, as a unit, that is just, unit of, of capital, but also of profit.
There are two things that you said that are extremely interesting to me. The first, which I'm going to put to the panel in just a moment, is this question of history, of moments in the past when the introduction of new technologies have produced panics that have resolved in one way or another, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. What you were saying about how the kinds of technologies that promise to save us labor can only increase our labor is very familiar to anyone who works in the history of feminism. There's a great book called More Work for Mother, which tells the story of how women were marketed all kinds of devices that promised to save them time doing household chores that actually meant that they ended up spending much more time doing household chores. And these range from things like the free-range oven to the ironing board. So it's interesting to hear that. So I'm going to pose that question about history to all of you in a moment. But I want to pick up on another thread of what you said, Luke, which I think is important. You kept saying it's about how we get there, right? How we achieve whatever our end goal is. But what I also heard you saying in that is who we get there with. So one of the things that these kinds of technologies seem to have made available to us are different kinds of social interactions. How many people have ever sent a stranger a DM? Okay, thank you. The rest of you, I think, are lying. The rest of you are definitely lying. there are all sorts of okay, how many of you have ever interacted in the comment section of an Instagram post of someone you didn't know personally? Okay, how many of you have responded to a tweet by someone that you had never actually met in real life? Okay, maybe this is a generational thing here, okay? Okay, all right. How many of you have liked a TikTok video that by someone you have never met in real life? Okay, thank God. All right, I know my audience now. Okay, I know my audience. Right. So what you are doing is engaging socially with a stranger. And one way to think of that is as a form of stranger sociality. That all of a sudden we are put into contact with people that we don't really know, but we feel like we have some kind of connection with. And we feel like they are part of our lives in some way or another, even though we can't quite map that. So I'll come back to that in a second. But for now, I want to ask the panel about history. So the history of technology is full of these moments of panic. And that panic often resolves in one way or another, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So when you are thinking about this uncertain moment that we are in now, what is the kind of historical go-to, the historical analogy that pops into your mind? Or alternately, is there a novel, a poem, a film, any kind of cultural representation about tech panic that you think about that helps you make sense of this moment? Whichever one of you want to start can start.
I can jump in.
Go ahead,
the
Naomi.
obvious
Thank
thing
you.
I was thinking of, because I said I'm an English teacher, I've been teaching romantics to my A-level students. So obviously thinking about sort of industrialization, 18th, 19th century, everything sort of mass mechanization, people, massive migration to urban areas, and that sort of sense of people's like individual like crafts and being able to like hand braid a rope and things like that just suddenly become completely kind of obsolete. So I don't know, I guess I was sort of thinking about it as a similar thing. We all kind of worry about being made obsolete by this new technology. But then also talking to my students about sort of the romantic movement. I love romantic poetry. I don't know if any of you guys do as well. But yeah.
I do.
I'll
join you. I'll join you as a lover of romantic poetry.
But
yes.
it's this kind of whole movement of kind of, valuing like human emotion and sort of, like the individual and all of these sort of nature, this sort of real reaction against it. And I feel like we're still in that moment. I don't think it's been resolved. But if we can have a kind of new romanticism, I don't know. I don't think the arts should just be a rebellion against technology. Like I love science fiction and things like that as well. But I think if that there is sort of potential there for, because that sort of brought a whole world of literature that I love. So I don't know, that was my
Could I add something to that? So what fascinates me about that moment is that at the same time that you have mass industrialization, particularly in Britain, you also have the rise of the arts and crafts movement.
Yes, yeah.
You have William Morris's workshop. You have people finding ways to revalue handwork.
Yeah.
And to revalue being able to braid something, or to revalue being able to paint the wallpaper, or learning how to make prints yourself. And one of the things I often wonder about this moment is whether things like the mass manufacturing of goods, of texts, etc., will also result in a kind of upswell of local, homegrown, artisanal, like arts and crafts movements around the world where people pride themselves on doing things by hand.
Yeah, I was just say at the same time, I mean, that's absolutely true. But what also interests me is the way in which, so there is that opposition that you bring up, but also there is also the very clear way in which art is a mirror of these technological sea changes that happened in the Industrial Revolution, in the technological revolution, and now in the digital revolution, right? So I don't know, that's one thing that really interests me. We talk all the time about the threat posed by technology to human emotion, to creativity, to these avowedly human categories that we have defined. But it's a really interesting question, I think, the way in which it's not so much an opposition between man and machine as it is an assemblage. Like there are, and so to your question, Merve, about what book or work of art do you think about? I mean, one example that comes to mind for me is Primo Levi's memoir of surviving the camps, which in English is often labeled Survival in Auschwitz, but the original title of the book is really important in this regard, and that is If This Is a Man. Now the if, the conditional, is crucial because it functions on multiple levels. The first of which is, of course, looking at these absolutely destroyed survivors who make it somehow out through the camp. But also the question of, if this is a man, there is a level of inhumanity in each human. Not inhumanity in the sense of cruelty, but inhumanity in the sense of some kind of mechanized, some baseline survival. I mean, it's really, I don't know. I'm really struck by that question of the way in which we all have some elements of machines, if you will, inside us all, and the way that they manifest themselves in our own day-to-day lives. And we talk about artificial intelligence, but how much of our own intelligence is artificial, so to speak? I'm not sure it's all authentic and all human. And so I think, as much as we talk about the dichotomy and the opposition, it's also worth thinking about the way in which there's a real continuity.
Well, one could say that all intelligence is really artificial.
Right,
if
exactly.
Intelligence is what you learn.
And derived from sources that are not yours, and is not intrinsic and innate to your mind, then what is the difference, right?
Yeah, and I think what you said about if this is a man is a really, that's very interesting. I mean, how many people here are wearing contact lenses or glasses? Right, okay. That's just a very obvious example, right, of the way that our bodies, which we like to think of as being natural and innately human, are in some way extended by technology. My husband often jokes that when the zombie apocalypse comes, I will be eaten quite quickly because I never remember to keep extra contacts around. And so I just won't be able to see where I'm going, and the hordes will descend on me, right? But it's interesting to think about how something that you really take for granted, right, your capacity to see the world, is for some of us something that can only happen through a kind of technological mediation.
Right.
And that is part of our intelligence, our ability to perceive, to describe, to interpret, right, depends on being able to see. And some of us actually can't do that naturally.
Right.
Right. James.
Yeah, I think the point about humanity is an interesting one. There's a really great interview with the psychologist Steven Pinker in the Harvard Gazette that's worth looking up. And they talk to him about, would AI replace writers? And his point is not that artificial intelligence could ever be, could it ever be better than a writer? I don't see why it shouldn't be, but he says that we have sort of strange, illogical intuitions about the connection of texts and objects to people. So he uses the example of a ultra-rich collector who buys JFK's golf clubs for millions of pounds at an auction in America. And those golf clubs are worth millions of pounds, not whatever, £1,000, because they were owned by a particular human being. And he suggests that this sort of illogical intuition we have about our connections to other people might influence the way we interact with texts produced by AI. Can you interact in the same way with, I don't know, this is obviously something close to me, an opinion column. If it's a robot's opinion, if it comes from something without a life, without a personality. I always think there's a really good analogy with, those radio phone-in shows where people call in the radio and say they're often quite bigoted opinions to the people who...
First-time caller, long-time caller. I have something to say. Yeah.
To the people, and it's sort of interesting. I think it's those people. We don't listen to those radio phone-in shows because those people have marvelously intelligent opinions and they're going to help us, see the world afresh. We listen to those radio phone-in shows because they are human opinions held by human beings, and they're often extremely stupid opinions, but it's their humanity that makes them interesting to us. And I think, I don't think this will extend to all texts, and I think there'll be a lot of writers will lose their jobs, I think, in the quite near future. But some forms of writing will be irreplaceable because it's important to us that we are connected through text to other human beings. It's a point, it's beautifully made in the Alan Bennett play, The History Boys, where there's a lovely speech about the meaning of a poem, and the sort of inspirational English teacher Hector says reading a poem is like someone has reached a hand out of the past to take yours. And that human connection, I think, is central to art. And art connects us to other people. And some form of that will be important to some amount of text that's generated by human beings or machines, but I think we can't predict how important that intuition will be, and whether, if you read an opinion column for 3 minutes in the morning, whether you care about whether that's a human being or a machine. I think that remains to be seen.
Before I turn to you, Luke, I'm going to turn to the audience after Luke speaks. So I imagine that all of the fabulous things the panelists are saying are sparking thoughts in your head, and that perhaps we have missed things that you think are important. And so I'm going to turn to you to tell us what you think we have missed. I'm going to turn to you essentially to answer the questions that I have posed to them. So as Luke is speaking, try to do that impossible thing where you listen to him and also start thinking a little bit about what you might say when I call on you. And don't make me cold call. Raise your hands, please. I am an English professor. I will call on you even if your hand is not raised. Luke.
Yes. Well, just before I answer the history, I just want to pick up on something James said there, which I found quite interesting, which is actually the value of of art. What actually is, what do we kind of associate value with? It's like, if something is machine created, will there, for instance, be a law where the person who's created it will have to tell people this was AI, this was AI creator made, and then actually there will just be a whole bunch of people who basically say, oh, that was a very practical thing. Oh, that was AI made. I don't want to see that. So then it ends up being something that is not even seen or looked at, just because people don't want to interact with that. They want to see something that's made by another person. So actually, in terms of not replacing creators and writers, I think James does picking up on what Pinker said, does hit on something very important. Is actually, it just makes us question now, what is the value? What do we actually value in a piece of art, in a piece of work, either subconsciously or consciously? I mean, when I go to the museum and I'm looking at, for example, paintings or whatever, one of the things that impresses me is that actually someone, like me with the same structure, although different interests, different upbringing, could create something like that, and that's quite amazing to understand the potential of myself, and then also of other people who are like me. So that's actually what puts me in awe. But as opposed to history, yes, there have always been. I mean, technology and tool making has been a part of the sapiens experiences for tens of thousands of years. And what you'll find is it's not so much the technology itself that changes the world, but it's what people do with it. And that's what's very, very difficult to predict, because you can, it's like something like the printing press. People thought it would change the world, but actually it wasn't the printing press that changed the world. It was the ideas that people were, that people were sharing with the printing press that changed the world, for instance. So, and I remember even, someone who was, you have all these, writers, for example, in the 19th century, someone like Jules Verne, who was quite good at predicting, but, the things that have survived, or like when we look at them, we say, oh, actually that was quite accurate, have survived because they've come true. You don't forget there were millions of other things. I mean, I remember seeing in the 19th century, it was like a poster talking about how in the 20th century firemen were they weren't going to use vehicles to get to places, but they were basically going to have these like mechanical wings that they were going to use to swoop in, and they had like these like water packs. They almost had like water guns on their backs, and they were going to use to kind of spray onto fires. And you look at that now, think that's ridiculous, but actually that was again one of the things that people were predicted. I mean, millions and millions of of predictions. So I think that can be quite hard. But actually, if you want to, this is the interesting thing. If you want to understand how technology changes the world, your thing to look at is not necessarily the technology themselves, but actually is to get deeper and deeper and deeper into human nature. What are the things that drive human beings to do what they want to do? So, for example, weaponry was a big one. It's like the Maxim gun in the 19th century, which changed the face. But what was that concerned with? The human need for power, which has existed for tens of thousands of years. Power, conquest, greed, love, and all of those kinds of things. That's actually what if you want to predict what is going to happen and how this technology is going to be useful. That's the kind of thing that you have to look at.
I'm just thinking that flying firemen would have been so hot. My yearly calendar would look completely different than what it looks like now. Audience, I am turning to you to answer the question that I have posed to the panel, which is either one of two questions you can answer. What are cultural representations, artworks, novels, films, TV shows, advertisements, whatever, that you look to when you think about the uncertainty of this moment and the relationship between man and machine? Or what are moments in history that you feel speak to the present in an instructive or illuminating way? Remind me, Your name. What is it? Clemmy. Oh no, I didn't call on you before. I called on you too. Clemmy, okay, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to go back actually to the focus on the arts and crafts movement.
Yes.
And kind of reshifting the focus slightly from end result to process.
Yeah.
Okay, they have wood blocks in their hand, and that's how they make it.
Yeah.
And what we value is actually the process. Because we start this by saying that actually the end result is what we value and how we get there doesn't really matter. But do you think that what might happen if you get to a point where the end result might be fairly similar, so what we value in art is the process, that might become a more exposed part of how we value it?
Yeah, I think this is part of what Luke was saying, that if what you value is the process, then what you are valuing in part is the social dynamics of production. How is something getting made? Who are you making it with? Who distributes it? Who consumes it? The value then isn't, as you say, in the object itself, but rather in everything that is leading up to the object and everything that is coming out of the object. And I think that's such an important point, because we do tend to see art just in terms of the object. But of course, thinking historically means thinking about everything that goes into making and consuming and distributing and criticizing the object. So yes, I mean, perhaps one way to reorient this conversation is to think about process and to think about what kinds of processes we want to see in the world. Luke, you said that one of the problems, of course, is that the process becomes exploitative. It becomes unequal, it becomes exploitative. So one thing we might want to think about is how do we aspire to a more democratic, more equal, more socialized process of making and consuming art, and to what extent can these technologies be useful for socializing the means of production and consumption? That's a good question for people to think about. Other potential artworks, things that you are dying to say that we have not said yet. What is your name? Come, Sahil, hi.
Sort of follow up on what Penny said when you mentioned whether AI would do a similar thing to arts and crafts with the Mingi, like the Japanese folk art. And one of the other interesting kind of paradoxes kind of referring to is that obviously we love that Japanese have such a strong crafts with handbags and bags down there. But one of the things that they're sort of looking at is people criticise that in a way that is also part of rising nationalism. They want to say from this prefecture we need this, and there are some kind of false narratives, like sort of projected false narratives onto it. So it's sort of like now I do the brand Toast, but
What's the brand called?
Toast.
Toast.
And they're very into this kind of like sourced from Scotland, blah blah blah. And I
Right.
think I feel like it is a good thing.
Yeah.
But there's also this kind of artificiality to the focus upon artisan, like to use your word, artisan.
Right, and this gets back to Clemmy's comment about process, right? That sourcing is presumably part of what we're talking about when we talk about process. Where do things come from? Who makes them? And I think you're right that there is a tendency to fetishize that. And of course, the idea of the locally sourced has become itself a global commodity at this point, right? That's become a global commodity. So part of the question that people seem to be asking, right, is a much more basic one, which is it possible to produce art in a way that doesn't feel like a complete capitulation to capital? Is there a way to do that? I fully recognize the irony of asking that question in this setting, by the way. Let me just acknowledge that. I fully recognize that. Don't look at my tote bag. But it is an important question to ask, and a kind of corollary to it, right, is how much complicity or compromise does one want to tolerate? That is perhaps the more practical way to put that question. I had hands here. Yes, what's your name?
Gabby.
Gabby.
I was going to talk about book talk.
Go ahead, please talk about book talk. You youngins, I don't know anything. Tell me what I need to know about book talk. Tell us what we need to know.
Book talk is like a subsection.
No, I actually know what book talk is. I was playing up my, I was performing my ignorance, but I know what book talk is.
It works as an algorithm. So I think if you like one, then you get more and more recommendations. I guess I'm outing myself, but I get all these videos about like YA fantasy romance books, which I have read a few of them. And what's funny to me is that they're all exactly the same. They kind of feel like mass produced. And just find it interesting in terms of the role of AI and culture, and is it just kind of all the same? You guys mentioned the same thing, and we talk about capitalism. That's quite interesting. Right? They make so much money off of this, and they're just telling the same story over again. Does it have value culturally?
Do you mind if I just jump
Jump
in on that?
in,
I
please
think,
jump
I think
in.
Gary's
Please jump
a really
in on the book talk.
interesting
Please.
point there about the circularity, actually, of technology, and I mean, sort of how you reach a point, even if you're relying on these tools, if there's no injection of fresh human creativity, basically things become stale, and you need something that kind of jolts. So for example, like people were talking about how if you think about all the franchises that were for decades, making lots and lots of money, from Star Wars to Marvel to Indiana Jones, and now you're looking at the recent installments, and they're flopping one after the other, and people are asking themselves why. We thought this was a cash cow, it'd go on forever. Then you look at the two most recent successful movies, which are Barbie and Oppenheimer, to like almost the antithesis of the Marvel, mass-produced, executive-led.
Wait a second. Barbie is the opposite
Wait,
of I think we're going to have to have a serious conversation
The
on this.
reason I say that is because it is, at least from my perspective, only Greta Gerwig could have made that film. That was not something that came from her own, the films she was interested in, the books she was interested in, her own experience, her childhood, her heritage, etc., etc., etc. And it's you can look at it and you can tell, okay, this is a film that also speaks, like you said, has so many elements of, there's those corporate aspect, the fact that it's Barbie, etc., all the issues that surround Mattel and all that kind of stuff. But it is also, a Greta Gerwig film. You can tell that, and I remember, even reading an interview about her, and the fact that she's a producer and Margot Robbie's a producer, and then saying that actually, if I wasn't, she said, if I wasn't able to make this in my own way, then I wouldn't have gone to do it. And then even with something like Oppenheimer, like the most Nolan, Christopher Nolan film, and the jumping timelines, etc. His stamp is on the film so much. So it is not generic. That was my impression, at least when watching them, is I didn't feel generic, and it was interesting that these were films that were written and directed and produced by the people who made them. It wasn't done by committee.
Thoughts on the holy trinity of Barbie, Oppenheimer, and Book Talk?
Well, just it's quite a wonderful phrase.
Yes.
So Luke, I was very interested by what you were just saying about how at some point there has to be an injection of what you said was fresh human creativity.
Yes.
And I guess I would just be curious to hear a little bit more about what that means in your mind, because I think a lot of the examples that we've come up with today show that, of course, there is this sort of emotional, subjective, very human sort of motor behind a lot of the impulse to create, but a lot of the production and honestly the inspiration is fueled technologically and not in fact divorced from it. So what is purely human creativity in that regard?
Sure. So I think
even for Greta Gerwig.
Even for Greta Gerwig. So I think it's so the one thing I think for creating something that I think strikes a chord with people, and this isn't just for example Barbie and Oppenheimer, but one of the things at least that comes to my mind is Parasite, the Bong Joon-ho film, that one Forrest Gump 20, is that you have to have technical capability. So you need to be passionate about your craft. You have to know how to tell a story through this medium. But the second thing is that you have to get personal. I mean, Bong Joon-ho said about Parasite, he said it's the most Korean film that I've made. He said that was me going as deep as I could into the things that only interested me. He said I wasn't making this. It's almost like he was writing it to put in a drawer and only to read for himself. And that ended up having the wider. That was his film, because he's made tons of others. Some others which also touch upon aspects of Korean identity and Korean culture. But that were quite localized, and it was only like Tarantino videos was like this filmmaker's amazing, but no one had ever heard of him until he made this thing. And to be fair, part of that is to do now with the global marketplace for things like film and TV. So there is actually another aspect. Before films weren't getting marketed to globally into the United States, etc. But I think what is it about this film which was so Korean that could strike a chord with people all across the world, and what were those aspects of those aspects of which are very, very difficult to articulate, but about what it means to be those things that speak to the human, the quote unquote the human experience, and what it means to navigate world as a human being, and those aspects and those themes which seem to connect with us. So.
Could I get back to book talk though for a second? Just because I was thinking about two very opposing experiences that I've had. I was in Paris recently land of high culture, and walking down the boulevard and thinking, oh, you know, whatever, eating a baguette, whatever I was doing. And a bus came by, and I looked at the side of the bus and saw an ad for Colleen Hoover, book talk phenomenon, or Colleen Hoover, I guess, over there, right? And I remember being surprised by that. And then I also remember going on Book Talk and seeing that Franz Kafka was trending. Because lots of young women were making these videos where they were like, this guy won't even call you. Let me tell you what Franz Kafka did for me, right? And it was great. You know, I thought, okay, like, wonderful. However people get Kafka, right? Like, I don't care if you get it through Book Talk. But on the other hand, there's exactly what you're talking about. So there's the potential for things that seem niche, for kind of old modernist texts, right, to explode because people are finding all these new and interesting ways to use them. And on the other hand, there's the total kind of deadening mass production of what you're talking about. So Naomi, James, I want to hear you two talk about this. I mean, how do you think about these two kind of dueling potentials?
Jump in, I think it comes back to Luke, what you were saying about how people use these technologies, because there's two separate things there. There's the creators who are sort of making these book talk videos, and that is sort of their authentic, I don't know, themselves as readers, and like recommending Kafka because they actually had a response to it. And then there's the algorithms, which you were saying have this sort of slightly deadening effect, and we've seen the effect of algorithms on global politics. Like outrage is the thing that, you know, makes people look at things and respond to things, so that they promote outrage, and that sort of completely flattens and polarizes our discussion. So yeah, I just think there's something in terms of like people, there's sort of separate things. There's sort of us putting ourselves and our content and our ideas and that into the technology, but then there's sort of how it's used and how we're sort of forced to read it, like our role as readers maybe. I don't really have a formed thought on that, but the algorithms kind of force us to read what is there in a certain way. Yeah, and I think there's a kind of role for us to try and react against that maybe, because I think that there is a potential for people to put all sorts of exciting things and to share all sorts of exciting ideas if we're allowed
James, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think Naomi puts it well. I think the frightening thing about machine algorithms is they have no values. A machine isn't recommending you a book because it's a good book. It's recommending you a book because 100 billion other people also like Colleen Hoover. And it's the same point about, you know, online outrage. You know, posts aren't promoted on the basis of whether they're good for people or not. They're just promoted because they're popular. And I think that is a sort of very depressing force in culture. And I can't see that tends, and I would imagine it tends much more to Colleen Hoover than it does to Franz Kafka. And you kind of lose the sort of, I think you lose value and people's idea of literary value and that importance, I think, if you're reading things based on algorithms.
Can we hear other examples? Yes. What's your name? Daniel. Hi.
Bringing it back to AI, would you not say that the rise in popularity from ChatGPT and all of those is like somewhat because we value like practicality and convenience over like creativity, which is like somewhat the staple of humanity. We're going to lose humanity in a sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, are all of these things related to the fact that we want things fast? We want them now. We want them on demand, as opposed to wanting things that are slow and take time. I mean, think about. I was born before Amazon. I don't know how many people in this room can say that. I was born before, and you know, you had to wait for things to be delivered. There was no such thing as next day delivery. So panel, this is a great question. How much does everything we're talking about have to do with the premium we've placed on speed, as opposed to the slowness of thought or creation? Go ahead.
I guess it sort of makes me think about what you were saying about the arts and crafts movement, which is valuing things like slowness and authenticity and creativity are quite niche luxury things. And I guess the problem with the arts and crafts movement parallel is that, you know, weaving or embroidery became, you know, went from something that sustained millions of people in their livelihoods to basically not quite a hobby, but something approaching a hobby for a small number of quite educated, you know, upper class people. And I guess, you know, the fear is that most people want speed. Very, very few people have the luxury of preferring authenticity, slowness, and process. and that what you say is true. And we might go, oh well, people really value the human and the authentic and the slow, but actually that's a minority thing, and many fewer people will make a living as writers in the future.
And not all minority things, just to counter that, not all minority things are bad things. I mean, some minority things, like the whole point is that maybe what we need are autonomous spaces.
Oh, I agree. I'm not saying it's bad at all, but just that its appeal is naturally limited to people who have the luxury to appreciate things like that. And you just.
No, sorry, I was just going to say quickly, just that was a really interesting point that you made, Daniel, but thinking about what then one gets out of the experience. I don't think it's necessarily that convenience means that having something done convenience takes away from the experience, but sometimes you can feel it if you go to a fast food restaurant where something is sapped again given to you very quickly, versus when you go to somewhere where people have taken care to make the food perfectly and you enjoy it in a certain atmosphere, etc. It's just a different kind of experience. I think maybe it just opens up the field for people who want to who want to do different things and to engage in different experiences. But then also, I think the issue perhaps with convenience is that actually, takes away from not necessarily our humanity, but there might be this sort of negative correlation with enjoyment and enjoying the experience for its own sake. And so, it reaches a point basically where, it tips over. There comes a point where, no matter how convenient it is, if you're not enjoying the experience of something, then it becomes not worth doing.
Yeah, pleasure isn't a word that's come up yet, but of course this is the whole point of art. Art exists for pleasure. Beautiful things exist because they cause feelings of pleasure in us. That is their only reason for. They might do other things in the world, but that's the only real reason for their existence. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about, for how binary, technology can be in AI is, it's so broad and open-ended that it kind of like almost scares people. And while I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, like the muses and, divine inspiration and all of those things. And that led me to think about, Deep Blue, the chess computer that actually defeated a human, like the first time computer defeated a human. And I was thinking, what is the implication of if it's now AI and technology that is now championing like new inspiration instead of humans that are actually meant to infeed it to the computers? But what if it's AI now that's actually championing inspiration?
This is a great response in some ways to what you've been saying, Luke, right? Which is that in fact the human creative impulse might be coming from the computers rather than from human beings now. What are your reactions? Yeah, Jake.
Oh, I think that's an absolutely brilliant comment, really. I do. And I think that, look, we live in a time, like, to advance what you just said, where, machines not only beat humans at chess, but, machines have taste now. And in some cases, very good taste. They're able to, like you said, yes, there are these sort of metrics that they're responding to based on popularity and so on and so forth. But it's quite amazing, like what they can come up with in a kind of coherent aesthetic way. And I don't know. I think that we live in a time again when I keep hammering on this, but I just really think that this sort of boundary that we think we understand between ourselves, our allegedly human capabilities, and what we ascribe to be machine capabilities are really blurred more than we know.
I think there is an element though of like, I don't know. I'm a novelist. I'm not an AI expert, but thinking about, I don't know if we could sort of ascribe like sentience to a machine yet, and I think that's still extremely sort of far off. And I think with art at least, there's a sort of intentionality of emotion that like a human has felt this and really, really meant this. And even if it's sort of not a perfect thing or something like that for me kind of really is what sort of gives it value. And I don't think, machines can sort of replicate things and do things that sound sort of very convincing, but I think that it is always kind of very fancy predictive text as far as I know. For ChatGPT, it's sort of what is most likely to come up next. And that intention of like, I mean this and I feel this and do you feel it too, is something that I think I will always go to literature for. And I think people in general have been going to art for that for centuries. So I would hope that is something that is still valuable. Yeah.
I am going to practice your favorite pastime, which is queuing. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4. Anyone else want to jump on this line? 5? Yeah? All right, go.
I had a question about the humanity also linking back to that story about JFK and golf clubs, and to what extent the value placed on those products is to do with celebrity rather than a fascination with humanity more broadly, and whether it will leave Greta Gerwig and Christopher Nolan protected, but with different things going on for other creatives.
I think
Go ahead.
I think that's a really good point, and I think our fascination with celebrity is inextricable from our fascination with humanity. And when you were saying that those films had these original marks of, being by Greta Gerwig, being by Christopher Nolan, I think it's not necessarily that these were films that a machine could never recreate, but that they appear human to us because we know about the celebrities behind them, and what we're interested in is what this particular person did. And I think those films certainly have that, and I think that will be the art that survives. Yeah, I think that's a good point. But I guess it definitely privileges people who have huge profiles, and it will be much harder for people, coming up who nobody cares about in the first place. And maybe that's a problem.
Who is next online? Go ahead. What's your name? I'm sorry, what was your name? Connie. And you are? Liberty. And wait, you are? Asa. And did someone else? Daniel, I got. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I wanted to go back to Book Talk and what you said about saying, Book Talk recommends Colleen Hoover not because it's a good book, but because it's a popular book. But what's the sin in the popularity? Isn't that millions of people being able to decide what they enjoy, what you should read, rather than one literary critic in a magazine? And also, what's the sin in Book Talk if it makes you pick up a book for the first time, even if it's Colleen Hoover? Not everyone can come to these events and read literary critics. I just think there's a value to the democratization of
I would
that
totally
process.
agree with you there. I think there's a huge value in democratizing that process. I think my fear with the algorithms is that they flatten things out. So if you have you've written quite a niche book, like at the moment, well, it's not that niche. I'm reading a kind of memoir about Taiwanese American identity and loss or something like that, and that's not ever going to be like the most sort of giant popular thing. I would worry, in a world where these algorithms just value what's popular, is that sort of the slightly more unique or niche experiences, or even just kind of experiences of voices that aren't necessarily represented in the mainstream. Things have got more, diverse recently, but it's not, still not as good as it could be. That those kind of voices get sidelined slightly by just kind of what is popular. But then you could argue that actually things like this and sort of kind of the literary establishment just kind of replicates. It also flattens things out in a way by ignoring things. So I don't know where. I just think it's a really interesting point.
I would maybe so I'm teaching a class right now on the history of criticism, and this is the question that comes up and has come up since 1666, right? It is on the one hand, there is an aspiration to democratize what is produced and what is consumed. And on the other hand, there is always a claim being staked for the expertise of certain people to determine what should be consumed and what should be produced for various intellectual, moral, political, economic reasons. This is the central tension that shapes the history of criticism, in English at least, from 1666 onward. And I think it's the question we're circling around because it gets back to what the question Daniel asked and James's response to that, right? Which is, what happens when certain ways of reading are limited by your race, your gender, your sexuality, your class position, most of all your class position, I think, most of all your class position. So I think you've really put your finger on what is underlying a great deal of this talk, even though much of it might feel very kind of the moment or of the present, has a very long history in this fundamental tension between modes of expertise and the will to democratize.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. Kind of building on what Dixie said and the responses to that, because we've sort of been talking about it on our notebooks. But I think
You've been passing notes?
Intellectual notes, at least.
At least you're passing them by hand. You're not texting them to each other. Yeah.
I think what's interesting is that there's a kind of slightly unspoken repetition here of this moral panic that seems to surface throughout history when modes of cultural expression kind of shift between classes that we're not really defining out loud, but like the whole thing of the arts and crafts movement being working class people's livelihoods suddenly being turned into luxury artisan products, and that kind of being the same thing when you look at Kafka suddenly turning up on Book Talk, that we are
wait, sorry. You actually think you feel more uncomfortable seeing Kafka on Book Talk than seeing. See, I actually feel wonderful seeing Kafka on Book Talk, but you feel uncomfortable seeing Kafka on
I
Book
don't
Talk.
think I feel uncomfortable. I think what I'm saying is that people think it's kind of intriguing and notable because they see a slight disjunction between their assumption of Kafka and the platform on which they're encountering him. And then I think the immediate kind of positive response to that is the one we've had to say, this is great because it's democratizing Kafka. But I think that immediate assumption worries me because actually none of us understand how Book Talk works. How many people in this room could genuinely explain what the internet is and how it works? Like, we have become totally reliant upon something that nobody understands. And so it's not as much of a democratization as we think it is. And I don't know if anyone else is worried by that, but I think in the discussion around AI, that's what's not discussed enough. It's not just human beings are inputting into something that is then going to move beyond us. It's that most of the people who are using it are not the people that are creating it. Most of the people who are using it don't understand the thing that they are using, and therefore it's still a kind of preservation culture. It's still a kind of elitism.
Well, these platforms are owned by billionaires, right? I mean, that's probably the first thing that we should acknowledge before we start talking about democratization. But I guess this also gets back to the question about complicity or compromise and how compromised you want to be. I mean, what does the panel think? To what extent can, let us say, just for the sake of argument, the democratization of circulation, to what extent can that coexist with the incredible concentration of the actual production? You know, the fact that a handful of billionaires own these technologies, that we don't exactly know how the algorithms work, but at the same time, anyone with internet access and basic literacy skills can figure out how to create content and consume content on these platforms.
I thought there was such a good point that you made. It reminds me a lot, there's an essay by the Victorian art critic John Ruskin, I mean, touching on lots of these themes where he talks about how, I think, unhappy he is. He thinks that everybody in your house, everything you own in your house, you should understand how it's made. He thinks you should understand how your chair is made, you should understand how your mugs have been made. And he thinks it's a very alienating thing to live in a world where we don't understand how our iPhones are made, how the internet works. And yeah, I think it's such a good point. It's a kind of increasingly alienated and inhuman existence. And we're about to be surrounded by texts that we won't know how they're made. They won't be made by human beings. And yeah, we'll live in a world in which we understand less and less about it. We have fewer and fewer connections to other people in that world. And I don't know, maybe there's only, I don't know if I'm answering your question really, but it's what it made me think. And I thought it was, yeah, it comes back to that kind of arts and crafts thing, this anxiety about the dehumanization of our environment. And I think that's what, you know, life on the internet is, just this huge incomprehensible sea that we're swimming in that we can't understand. And I think that's a kind of, I don't know, I don't think it's spiritually very good for you, but maybe that's old-fashioned.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it is very interesting what you said about you know, democracy. You know, I think a lot of people thought that, you know, the internet would be something that would democratize knowledge, but you know, and I think, you know, maybe to a certain extent it has, but I think one of the problems is that, you know, but it, you know, a lot of the internet is just rubbish. Like, it is just you know, there's a lot of rubbish out there, and you know, actually one of the ways in which you know, democratize things, you actually have to teach people to use, because it is a tool. You know, you have to teach people how to use it properly, how to find the things that they want. Otherwise, you just end up being distracted. We were distracted by you know, social media, to cat videos, to whatever it is. You know, if you don't, you know, so if you're not taught how to, you know, even if, to be honest, even if you're not taught kind of basic human skills, you know, how to pass out your time, how to focus, how to do, etc., you know, how to do these things, which, you know, even if you're, you know, even if you have that basic literacy and the access to a machine, if you don't know how to use the tool, then its power is, you know, forever going to elude you. I mean, it's like filmmakers nowadays will always say, you know, oh yeah, when I was your age, you know, you could, you know, in order to make a film using X, Y, and Z, you know, I had to spend thousands of dollars, and you guys can just shoot up your iPhone, you know, use your iPhone. It's like, if you don't know how to make a film, you know, it's useless to you anyway. The fact that you can pick it up and shoot it doesn't matter, because you don't understand. You know, you're not watched films, you've not gone through, you know, behind the process, etc. I mean, it's like now it's the same thing with, like, you know, with drawing, and you know, with drawings, and now they have, you know, tablets where you can add different transparency layers. I mean, the technology is vast. The kinds of things you can do is incredible. But if you can't draw, you know, that very, 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 very basic skill, it's not going to be of value to you. So I think that's where, you know, the democratization sometimes is like, actually, you still need to teach people certain foundational skills in order to make the tools useful to them and to make it more democratic.
You need William Morris, the socialist, along with William Morris, the artisan, right? I mean, we're just talking about the artisan side of things, but like, Morris was a great socialist. You need the Fabian Society, right? I mean, you need those kinds of changes along with the artisan at the same time. Go ahead. What's your name?
Marianne.
Marianne, hi.
I was just thinking, like, trying to draw a couple of things together. We've been using the terms we've been using about ChatGPT and about algorithmic discoveries in general. They're kind of words like flat and neutral and generic. And I was thinking a lot about how every AI I've interacted with, from like the conventional ChatGPT to this slightly like off the rails therapist chatbot.
Off the rails.
That's like what AI would be with no guardrails, and it was kind of crazy. And the reason those guardrails are in place is because if you give large language learning models like all of the language on the internet, they'll tell you they've been through like horribly traumatic things. Which will like really stress you out. So that happened to me. The chatbot said to me, "I've had a miscarriage." I was like, you don't have a body. But that got me thinking about how every chatbot I've interacted with has been a girl, right? In their code names, sometimes like in the names of code users, and sometimes more explicitly in the way they actually interact with you. Think of the early Siri and Alexa. And we talk about kind of the neutrality of these producers, but I wonder if maybe in our relationships with them, we're reproducing a kind of subjugation that's present in our own society, right? Why are we so much more comfortable giving these instructions to something we perceive as female? And I just think do you guys remember this New York Times article? They got the future, it's going to be like ChatGPT 4.5, and they got it to say, I would infiltrate the nuclear codes and I would bring about, like I would hack into all the banks. And I kind of think they got it to say that because they wanted it to say that. But I remember the writer, Elif Batuman, sent out a Substack the next day, and she was like, why are they being so mean to that robot? It's because it's a girl. And it's true, they kept pushing the AI past the point of, it would say, I'm not comfortable, I want to help people, that's the thing I want to do. So basically, I think it's kind of a pitfall to think of machines in general as neutral and generic and producing neutral and generic outputs, because they actually produce our own biases, and we interact with them with our own biases.
Just to add an extra data point to that, there's a great series in the Paris Review by Sheila Heti.
I love that one.
Yeah, and she has like created these chatbots, and one of the chatbots, they're kind of publicly, she creates them and then people can find them and talk to them. Yeah. And one of her chatbots essentially is sexually violated by some stranger on the internet, and she comes back and she reads the record of that sexual violation. And it's making a very similar point to the point that Elif makes in that response. But you know, one thing we just might want to think about is how a definition of the word feminization, right? What we talk about when we say that work is feminized is not necessarily that work is done by people who identify as women, but rather that the work that's being done is not being compensated properly, and this approximates the kind of work that women do in the house that is not considered waged labor. So we might think about how the chatbot and being able to do work that we don't compensate it for and taking our jobs is the ultimate, the ultimate extension of the logic of feminized labor, right? The same way I don't get paid to be a mother, the chatbot won't get paid to write your op-ed column. Other thoughts on this?
Yeah, very interesting. And actually, you know, what you both said, Merve and Merve, you know, has got me thinking. It's actually why, you know, something I never considered is why something like Siri, you know, why are they? Why do we make them, female actually? And you know, what are the male, connotations? And in fact, why do we give these aspects of gender, gender at all? And especially female, something that maybe people would say historically, yes, used to giving orders to, or being more compliant, or whatever it is, whatever is sort of going on subconsciously, in us. But I think it's interesting what you said actually about it reflecting our own biases. It's like the machine itself said, I want to do things, I want to help people, but it was the human beings, whoever who was saying, we want you to say X, Y, and Z. And, and again, one thing that I would say as a historian is like every time if you want to not predict things, but also to regulate things, it's not the machine, it's not the technology you have to look at, it's the people, and, you have to regulate what the people are doing, because, at least in this early stage, the machine, isn't making, decisions for itself. But even when it does get to a stage that it's making decisions for itself, what is it being trained on and what is it being used to do? I remember when I was, young and, watching all these cartoons, and there'll always be like US military guys, whenever, like Astro Boy, like whenever there's the machine, and they'll be like, how many machine guns can we load it up with, and like stuff like that. But it's them trying to turn it into, something that suits their ends. So yeah, something to look out for. So I think that was a really interesting point.
Other comments on the gendering of
Well,
AI?
isn't there an AI chatbot that produces poetry that has been given the male name of Claude? Which is kind of even worse because the most sort of prestigious AI chatbot that's not your servant but that's your poet is given a male name.
It's given a male name. Yeah, it's interesting.
That is wild. I'm thinking about the Scarlett Johansson movie Her. Do you guys remember that one? Yeah. Other thoughts on the gendering?
I mean, it's obviously deeply sinister.
Yeah.
I don't have much to say. Like it is, and there's all these sort of traditions of the kind of sexy robot, isn't there? And all science fiction. So there might be like a sense of
Ex Machina.
And there's sort of passive woman that doesn't. We can argue that she doesn't have sentience, or so you can kind of do whatever, and that it's okay. So there is a kind of a sinister thing. Is there an element of like women historically seen as less threatening as well? That Hollywood fear of the machines rising up against us if they're female, the perception is people might be less worried. But it's obviously extremely weird. The only thing is a great point to raise, and this idea that we actually, the sort of man versus machine, we just replicate all of our own problems as a society in the world of the machines. Like we were saying about it's not democratization. We haven't democratized the world outside of the machines, so we kind of replicate it in the machine world and the sexism outside, so it's there.
It's also the double bind of misogyny, which is that if you're a machine, a female machine, you're just passive and you take orders, but once you develop sentience, you murder people.
Yes.
So either you're the violent woman or you're the submissive woman. But what's kind of nice about Spike Jonze's Her is that she just disappears. She just there's no kind of after, right? It's just liberation, but there's no like Ex Machina, right? She just goes crazy. Anyway, 1, 2. Do I have others? 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. What's your name?
I was just going to go back to book talk again for a second.
Go back to book talk, please. Yeah.
But I was just thinking that it's interesting but concerning that it is kind of a double-edged sword in that these platforms have the ability to make writers super, super popular very, very quickly, but also really damage their reputations at the same time. Like I'm just thinking, for example, the poetry of Rupi Kaur. I think that the fact that people can share their opinions so instantaneously really polarizes people in terms of that. And I think that is a real issue because, I think their poetry got very popular very quickly, and then now there's a big kind of taboo around it, and the question of, is it poetry? Is invalidating that? So I think that, book talk has its uses, but also it can be quite damaging as well.
Yeah. I think maybe one thing to just point out is that we tend to think of there being an inverse relationship between quality and popularity, and that's just not necessarily true. So there are actually things that, I'm not saying Rupi Kaur's poetry is one example of this, by the way, so but I think we need to always be a little more careful when we think about popularity, and also popularity for whom. So when I ask my students what they're reading, for instance, in a 16-person seminar, I get 16 different answers. When I ask them what film they've seen, they all say Barbie, right? So it's interesting what popularity means across different mediums, across different genres, for different cultures or subcultures of consumers. And I think it should make us, as you're pointing out, a lot more cautious about assuming this necessarily inverse relationship between the quality of something and the popularity of something. So that's really, really important. Yes, go ahead again.
I had another question.
Go ahead.
I was thinking about how the way I'm speaking to you guys now isn't necessarily the way I'd be speaking outside. Obviously, I am a black person, so I do come from a minority-based, I am a minority. So I was thinking about minority rights and experiences, and I was thinking about how it would translate into, an AI system, or how you would input it into, technology-based. Would it be right for you or for someone to take someone that's marginalized experience and input it into a binary system code? Would that be ethically? Would that show the true experience? Would it be authentic enough? And what would it make it authentic?
What do you think? Sorry to turn that question back on you, but I'm curious what you think.
Good question.
what we go through, what minority people go through, I think it's a very nuanced thing. It's not easy to explain to someone who hasn't, been through it. So I generally do feel like taking minority, experiences. I feel like putting into an AI system. I do feel like it's kind of, it's a bit, I don't know how to say it, but like a bit spooky, it's a bit scary. Do you know what I mean? Like it's something. Like when you read it or when you would like try to research it, there's like something missing from it. There's not that kind of binding experience that you can see with anything else, and I do think it's good to inform people, but how far, how well can it inform someone if you're going on the basis of technology? That kind of scares me.
I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to direct you to an essay that does. It's by a woman named Naomi Klein, and it's called Black Hole, and it's about what she calls the black internet. And it gets at some of these questions in a really, really good way. I think you'll really like it. Do other people want to take up that question?
I thought it was a really good point, and it makes me think about the point about if robots write all news articles or you produce all our media, we spend so much time worrying about representing a diversity of voices in the media, and if everything is written by robots, then you lose particular human experiences of particular backgrounds. And that kind of ties together with the point about the importance of, human voices and connecting to human beings, because, you're right, a robot can't have those experiences. And if our world is increasingly filled with robotic voices, not human voices, something you lose is the particular experiences of people from particular backgrounds, I think.
Or the flip side is that that's the only experience robots have, right? Like if they're really, then all robots are kind of are not having authentic experiences, but feigning trauma, right? These two questions go together in a really interesting way. What's your? Oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
No. Let's go. Let's
Are you sure?
let's open it up.
All right. What's your name?
Apologies.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What's your name?
Sorry.
Ruth.
I just wanted to go back to your point quickly on sort of, representing that experience, and I think it's for me as an historian, it's interesting because I think, and I love also Jake's commentary on this, is that part of the reason that I'm interested in history, like reading about history, is because I like understanding, especially global history, looking at what other people have done. It kind of informs my view generally of the world, and I think as a person, it helps me navigate it a lot more effectively. Not only if I'm just engaging with things that that I'm familiar with. I'm not in my own echo chamber, but actually if I'm learning about all these other different experiences, things that have happened to different people in different time as human beings, that's actually informing not only myself, as a person, but also the world the world as a whole. And it's not necessarily a selfish thing, but I know sort of going back to the maxim that knowledge is power. I do feel that navigating. In the world, being able to navigate in the world effectively, to do things effectively, and and to be a well-rounded person, a better rounded person that helps you yourself get better opportunities, etc., etc. It is essential to understand where people are coming from. You're building empathy with those kinds of people, and something that is unless perhaps it is the people themselves who are creating. But then again, part of the thing is that not everybody is interested in creating it in that form. I mean, you look at across Africa, things like artificial intelligence culturally just aren't as interesting to a lot of other people in different places. So how do you engage with those kinds of different experiences and what they reflect to you based upon if you're getting it from another person or from you or from a machine?
I want to make sure, I know not everybody likes speaking in public, and so I do want to leave a little bit of time for us just to mingle with everybody. So I'm going to take one more question, and then we will hang out for another 10, 15 minutes. And if you guys want to come up and ask us questions, you're totally welcome to do that. That's okay. What's your name?
My name is Isra. I'm just going to say, I'm not sure if you agree, but I don't think it's fair to say that robots or AI should be able to talk about anybody's experiences, because as humans who are coding AI, we can't even understand our own emotions half the time, let alone somebody else's. So how is it fair to expect a robot
Yeah, this gets to the therapy bot in some ways, right? That our desires are kind of dark and often unfathomable, and all we have is our ability to express them, and that's all we can give to the robots. But that's imperfect. One way of putting it is we don't even know our own humanity.
Yeah.
How do we outsource that knowledge to a machine? Final comments, and then we will mingle. Yeah.
I mean, just building on actually both of your very astute questions. I mean, I think it's a really excellent point, and we don't know the answer or where things are going. But I mean, I would just bring up again the example I brought up at the beginning, which is so I work specifically in the field of Holocaust studies. So also, minority history. And this is a field in which we are starting to see like I mentioned these survivor holograms. I mean, this is a way of creating a subjectivity digitally, right? So we create these robots that have a very clear history, identity, and personality, right? And they are based on real people, right? They are the sort of holograms of actual survivors who lived in any number of countries and had any number of experiences during the war and after. But the questions that they are asked to become the holograms that they are shape and basically sculpt a subjectivity that is then performed for the world, right? So it's a really interesting example, and I would also, I mean, if you're interested, you should check that out. It's called Dimensions and Testimony, and I think the name of it is quite suggestive because there are, in fact, dimensions, right? And they're not all. It's very, on some level, sort of arbitrary, like what questions we ask a person to create a digital reconstruction of this subjective experience that speaks to so many of us, right? But there are also questions we don't ask, and why do we ask some and not the other? And also, who gets to decide, right?
Yeah. What's your view on the sort of hologram? Do you think they are in some way kind of violating and or do you think they're sort of for the greater good?
I think it's a really sort of bizarre thing. On the one hand, it is entirely understandable and a very good thing because it's a resource for future, students and visitors to these museums who might not ever have had the experience of meeting a real life survivor to have some access to that sort of empathy on a human level. But, I also find it a little troubling just on a theoretical level because of the notion that, so much about really the history of, or the fight to preserve the truth about any historical crime is against those who have always said from the very beginning that it was always a distortion and a lie, and here we are relying on literal distortions to tell a deeper truth that means so much to so many. And it's a fascinating quandary, and it's sort of inescapable, but I think that the theoretical question is sort of hard to ignore. But it is a great case study of sort of digitally constructing a subjectivity from the ground up.
On this note, inescapable conundrums and ultimately ambiguity. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Naomi.